Well, hello, minds. It's Brian Jackson. Sorry it took me so long to upload this. I've actually been unexpectedly busy. But as promised, here's chapter 3 of my novel Lightwarriors. This is a bit of a shorter chapter, so it's going to go a little faster, but I certainly hope you all enjoy it. Thank you. Chapter 3 The Suicide of Judy Taylor 1. A week after David and Catherine found Charlie, Judy pronounced her physically well, though she had much psychological healing ahead of her. She still felt weak and tired much of the time, and her appetite remained poor. Food was tasteless and nauseating. Some days, simply getting out of bed took all of her energy. She would often sit alone in her room, staring into space, lacking the energy or will to do anything more, barely able to keep from bursting into tears. It didn't matter. Nothing was fun anymore. Everything she used to enjoy had become meaningless and often unpleasant as it brought back painful memories. David and Catherine did their best to comfort her and make her feel loved, and she had grown close to them. She had only known David and Catherine for 2 weeks, but they had become her family. She felt as if she had known them for years. She thought perhaps this was because of the power. It connected her to David and Catherine in a way, made them brothers and sisters afflicted with the same curse. This curse that made them, the three of them, other, and brought them together in a way that transcended time. They felt like family, and they were the only family she had left. Still, it wasn't enough. They weren't her parents. One night, David and Catherine went out and bought The Little Mermaid. It was Charlie's favorite movie, but she couldn't enjoy it. It reminded her too much of her parents. She sat through half of the movie and then asked to go to bed. Charlie missed her parents terribly. The pain was unbearable. Most of the time, she tried not to think about them at all. Sometimes, she couldn't help it. She would see something or hear something that reminded her of Mommy and Daddy and burst into tears. Fear hung over her like a dark storm cloud. Charlie was plagued by flashbacks and horrible nightmares. In these, she was plunged back into the terrifying prison of the NSA's Fowler Point compound, or running scared from men intent on spilling her blood. She would awaken from these with sudden shuddering sadness. Her body coated in sweat. She was not so much pulled from sleep as ejected like a fighter pilot from his cockpit. She would be screaming and unaware of it, frightening David and Catherine into her room. On Monday morning, she had a bad nightmare. She was in the park with David, and he was pushing her on the swings. At first, it was great fun. Charlie laughed and squealed with pleasure, begging him to push her higher and higher. At the height of one swing, something caught her eye. She recognized it at once in that strange way that one always recognized things in a dream. It was Robin Stryker, the man who had pretended to be her friend, and then killed her father. He was standing on the edge of the playground, his back to the sun, his figure little more than a shadow in the bright sunlight. As she watched him, Robin drew a long rifle from within his long coat and stalked towards her with deliberate slowness. Charlie was terrified. She wanted to cry out to David, to scream a warning, but she could not find her voice. Rapid panic set in. Charlie's breathing became swift and shallow, and her heart began to pound so hard that she thought it would burst from her chest. "Oh, please no. Please not again." David had stopped pushing her, and the swing was still. Charlie sat frozen in place, wanting desperately to jump up and run away, yet unable to. Robin stopped 6 feet away. His silver eyes were cold. He raised his rifle and took aim. A cruel smile played across his thin lips. Then she was awake, sitting bolt upright in bed, muscles racked with fierce shudders, her body soaked in sweat. She wasn't screaming, but she was badly frightened. Robin was dead. She had killed him herself. Yet she was still terrified. The image of him standing over her lingered for a moment longer before it faded, leaving only fear behind. The power raced within her mind, turning the bedroom air explosively hot. Charlie bit it back fiercely, sending twin spires of searing pain ripping through her skull. "Stop it! Stop it now!" The power continued to spiral upward, sharpening the pain in her head to a terrible, screaming crescendo. She wanted desperately to let go, for she knew that the moment she did, the pain would immediately turn into pleasure. Yet she dared not. The images of the inferno at Fowler Point remained fresh in her mind. She did not want to hurt David and Catherine. They had tried to help her. Stop it! For a moment, the power continued to accelerate. Then something within disengaged, spun free for a moment, and the power went silent. Charlie remained frozen in place for several minutes before rational thought returned. Robin's dead. He can't hurt me anymore. The thought brought little comfort. Charlie knew that Robin was dead. She had watched him burn to death in her flames, but the dream's grip permeated her emotions. Charlie's eyes drifted around the bedroom. It was still dark out. Dim artificial light filtered into the room through the large windows in the right wall. In the daylight, the room had a warm, cheery air that she found comforting. Now it felt cold and haunting. In the dim twilight of the night, the antique furnishings made her feel as though she were in a haunted house. Charlie shuddered hard. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. This fear. It wasn't only from her nightmare. There was something more. Charlie turned and picked up the big pen from the bedside table. 1 o'clock. It was so late that it was early. The room was silent, save for the muffled sounds from the city streets below. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and yet she was afraid. Something was very wrong. Her instincts were screaming. Charlie's heart began to race. She slid to the edge of the bed and crossed the room in total silence without bothering to turn on the light. She had to tell David and Catherine. 2. The sound of the telephone awakened David from a deep sleep. At first, he took it for part of a dream and ignored it. After the 4th ring, David realized he was not dreaming and fumbled for his iPhone. Hello? Before the caller even had a chance to reply, a sudden and powerful sense of foreboding struck David. Hello, David. It's Rob. Rob Perkins was Judy's boyfriend. David didn't know him as well as he knew Judy, but they were friendly. Something's happened. He didn't have to finish. David already knew that something horrible had occurred and was terrified. Still, he wanted to hear it. What happened? Rob was silent for a moment. Judy's dead. I don't know what happened. The police said it was suicide. They found her on the floor in our office with a bunch of pills all over the place. They said she overdosed on barbiturates. He broke off. I don't understand. She was happy. We were going to get married next year. I can't believe she would kill herself. The phone slipped out of David's hand. Thick, oily sweat coated his skin. Jesus. His voice was little more than a frightened whisper. Who was that? Catherine's voice was thick with sleep. David did not reply. He could still hear the faint whisper of Rob's voice on the phone, but it no longer held any meaning or interest to him. His mind was focused on only one thought. Charlie! What? Catherine asked, more asleep than awake. What's going on? Judy's dead. What? What happened? Who did it? They said she committed suicide, took an overdose of sleeping pills or something. David was shaking with terror now. Jesus. Charlie! His mind repeated. David jumped out of bed. We have to go, now. His calm and controlled tone surprised him. Catherine gave him a strange look. Where? Where do you... She broke off. Oh, God, you don't think... David nodded. She saw Charlie 3 weeks ago, and now she suddenly kills herself? Do you really think that it just happened? Catherine's eyes widened, but then she shook her head. David could feel the force of her denial and fear. You think it was the NSA? David said nothing. Why would they kill Judy? She didn't know anything. As she spoke, David could sense that Catherine already knew the answer, but refused to acknowledge the truth. Catherine, the NSA does signals intelligence and surveillance. All it would take would be an intercepted phone call or a few minutes of video. Charlie used to live in Manhattan with her father. They had to have been looking for her here. Catherine did not reply. David sensed her internal struggle as she did not want to believe what was happening. Finally, she resigned herself to the reality of the situation. What do you want to do? David opened the dresser and took out a pair of jeans. Get dressed. We have to go. As he spoke, David heard the bedroom door open. He turned to see Charlie silhouetted in the light from the hallway. You know, too. She spoke with the resignation and sadness of one who has experienced prolonged suffering from which there is no escape. We have to run. I'm so sorry. David and Catherine both went to her. In his heart, David felt deep compassion for this young girl who had suffered so much in her short life. It's going to be all right, Charlie. Somehow it'll all come right. As he spoke, David was struck by the sudden realization that nothing would be all right for a long time. Instinctively, David drew Catherine and Charlie to his chest and hugged them with desperate strength. Catherine met his gaze with a question in her eyes. David said nothing. He had no plan, no idea of how to handle the situation. He only knew they were in danger. 3. 10 minutes later, David watched Catherine dress in silence. He knew that this was a turning point. Once the three of them left the house, there would be no going back. They would become fugitives. Their lives, as they knew them now, would be over. Part of him balked at the thought. He had spent half his life in a desperate struggle to be normal. He would be throwing all of that away if he tried to run with Charlie. But it was already gone. Any hope he had for a normal life had died when he and Catherine found Charlie in Central Park. Catherine finished putting on her sneakers, and the two of them went to get Charlie before heading down the stairs and out the front door. 10 minutes later, they entered the building's underground parking garage. David had no idea of what to do, but he knew they couldn't use his car to flee. The NSA would know they were running the moment he started the car. Having no other options, David used the power to steal a car from the garage. He felt bad about doing this, but he needed a way to get to safety without tipping off the NSA too soon. It didn't make it okay, but at least there was a good reason. It was surprisingly easy. All he had to do was reach out with his mind, and the car kicked over by itself. Not long after, the three of them were headed towards the George Washington Bridge on their way out of Manhattan for the last time. From the bridge, David would take Interstate 80 across northern New Jersey and into Pennsylvania on their way west. David had no specific plans, but it had occurred to him that they could catch a container ship out of the Chicago port, across the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, and then to Europe. Black despair welled up in David's heart. They would have to show ID to get out of the city, and the moment that they did, the NSA would know they were trying to run. The situation was hopeless. 4. An hour and a half later, they had driven through Manhattan and the Bronx and were approaching the checkpoint before the George Washington Bridge. Ahead, the road split into 6 cattle chutes. At the end of these was a structure that resembled one of the old toll booths, except that this structure was made of concrete and was sealed at the opposite end by a row of 20-foot electrified steel gates. 2 heavily armed state troopers guarded each gate. David carefully applied the brake, stopping beneath the overpass. His heart was racing, and he had to struggle not to tremble. Both state troopers lowered their M4 carbines and ambled up to the car, flanking it on either side. This is it. In a couple minutes, the NSA will know we're trying to run. David could feel Charlie and Catherine's fear radiated out at him. The trooper on David's side knocked on his window. David rolled it down. Yes, officer? Somehow he managed to keep the fear out of his voice. May I see your identification, sir? David turned off the car and gave the cop his ID card. The man reached in with one leather-gloved hand and took the small plastic card while keeping his rifle leveled with the other. He gave it a cursory glance. I'll need to see your passenger's ID as well. Catherine handed her ID card over as she mumbled something about Charlie having lost her ID at a rest stop. Catherine's fear was palpable. The state trooper motioned with his rifle. Please step out of the vehicle. David, Charlie, and Catherine got out without a word. A cold breeze stirred the otherwise quiet air. A slight shiver took David. He was thankful that it was cold enough out to warrant wearing a heavy jacket. Otherwise, the 2 state troopers would have seen his shirt plastered to his chest and back. He glanced at his wife and adopted daughter. Both looked deeply frightened. Catherine's excuse was paper thin and would likely get them caught. The first state trooper motioned with his weapon. This way, please, sir. David followed him into the booth on his left. Inside was a card reader, a thumbprint analyzer, and a retinal scanner. David stared at them with fear in his heart. In another minute, he would be arrested and dragged off to be taken by the NSA. They would verify his ID, a red flag would come up, and the three of them would be arrested. David studied the state trooper. The man was of average height and build, but he had a 10mm Glock pistol in addition to his rifle, and he looked like he could handle himself in a fight. Belatedly, David found himself wishing he had listened to his father and developed his powers. David went through the entire ID verification process, expecting any time to be dragged away in cuffs. To his surprise, he passed without a problem. David was incredulous. What the hell? Instead of feeling relieved, he was more frightened and suspicious. The NSA had to have put a flag on his file, but the state trooper was letting him go. Why? It didn't make sense. David walked back to the car, feeling confused and frightened. As he drove away from the New York City checkpoint, David again wondered what it was he and Catherine had gotten themselves into. Their progress was agonizingly slow. With each passing minute, David's fear and tension increased, as he expected to encounter a roadblock at any moment. After an hour had passed, he was gripping the wheel with white knuckles and trembling. 5. It was close to dawn. The sky had gone from jet black to deep purple. David had stopped at the top of the exit ramp for Ashford, Pennsylvania, waiting for the light to change green. There were no signs or billboards indicating a nearby hotel, but he and Catherine were exhausted and could drive no further. Do you see any place where we can rest? Both Catherine and David had left their cell phones at home, and they dared not use GPS for fear of being tracked. Catherine yawned and glanced at an old atlas for a moment before shaking her head. Ashford's to the right, but I don't see any hotels. David felt his chest fill with desperate exhaustion. They would have to sleep in the car then, because he couldn't go much further safely. Without thinking, without concern for the still red light, David turned right. Trees floated by on both sides in a blurry dream. David's head swam with exhaustion. Someone was talking, but he could not make out the words. David! It was Catherine, and her voice was upset, though he could not understand why. Be careful, you almost ran off the road. David shook his head clear and suddenly realized he was driving on the shoulder. Without slowing down, he cut the wheel to the left, hauling the car back into the driving lane. Though a small gesture, getting the car back onto the road took tremendous effort. David had little energy left in him and had to fight to keep his eyes open. After traveling an unknown distance, David carefully applied the brakes and turned left onto a heavily wooded, narrow dirt road. David could feel Catherine's gaze. David, where are we going? I don't know. He gave the engine a little gas. The car lurched forward and began to bump and thud along the dirt road. I think we're going to be sleeping in the car tonight, and this road looks fairly private. In truth, David was unsure of why he had chosen this particular road when any road would have suited his purpose. The road wound its way through the woods for several miles before terminating in a steel cattle gate. David stopped in front of the gate and got out. Catherine called after him. David, where are you what are you doing? Upon reaching the gate, David found it latched but not locked. David unlocked the gate and pulled it open. It seemed to take a tremendous effort. David's legs felt like lead. A few minutes later, he was back in the car, and they were on their way again. After another mile of bumps and thuds, the road abruptly ended in front of a derelict log cabin. David stopped the car and turned to Catherine. Wait here with Charlie. I'm going to have a look around. David intended to find out if the log cabin was indeed empty, and if so, he would break in. He was not proud of this, but he saw no other options. They needed shelter, somewhere quiet, and at least somewhat safe, where they could rest for a few hours before getting back on the road. David found the cabin was indeed abandoned. The front windows, while not boarded up, were festooned in cobwebs and dirt. David found electric and gas meters that had long since been shut off. He tried the front door and found it dead-bolted. David let out a tired sigh. He could open it with ease, but he hated to use the power. After a moment's pause, David reached into the power, feeling an invisible river. Then he thrust it out at the lock. A warm, pleasurable sensation washed through him as the bolt thudded clear and the door fell open. David returned to the car to find both Catherine and Charlie fast asleep. For what he hoped would be the last time that evening, David shook Catherine awake and then gathered Charlie up into his arms before heading into the log cabin. 6. As David, Catherine, and Charlie settled into the abandoned log cabin in Ashford, Pennsylvania, a chestnut-haired woman sat behind a wide red oak desk, drinking an espresso and reviewing a report on Charlie McLeod and the McAuliffe's flight from Manhattan to Ashford, Pennsylvania. 2 agents were assigned to dispatch: Dr. Judy Taylor, the physician who had treated the girl. The chestnut-haired woman had sent another 24 NSA operatives, together with an asset, to find and kill the girl and the McAuliffes. Fortunately for the McAuliffes and the girl, the operatives arrived late, only to find an empty house. The chestnut-haired woman gave an involuntary shudder. Though her position with the NSA gave her carte blanche to dispatch assets as needed, she nevertheless hated to do so. The blank-faced, soulless assassins deeply disturbed her, and though she would not have admitted to anyone else, they absolutely terrified her. The chestnut-haired woman skimmed further down the report. They had intercepted a call between one Judy Taylor and David McCall. Okay, Danielle, 1 second. Can you wait nicely? They had intercepted a call between one Judy Taylor and a David McAuliffe discussing the recovery of a mysterious little girl that David and his wife Catherine had found in Central Park a week ago and had placed both Taylor and the McAuliffes under surveillance. Then, at 2000 hours last night, the girl used her power, confirming that she was indeed Charlie McLeod, the same little girl who had burned her way out of the Fellow Point compound a little over a month ago. Jane Rickman, Captain Rickman, to those who worked under her, commanded the NSA's Office of Covert Action. Although she had no direct involvement with the program that gave birth to the assets who would later be placed under her command, Captain Rickman had become as familiar with the program and its aftermath as any of the men and women who had overseen it. Project Black Wolf began in the 1970s as an offshoot of the MK-Ultra experiments. Then the original goal at that time had been to test biomodifying drugs as a means of introducing physiological and neurological enhancement in human test subjects. Unofficially, the intent had been to artificially breed so-called enlightened, or men and women gifted with inborn psionic abilities such as telekinesis, electrokinesis, ESP, and other related abilities, together with an instinctive knowledge of weapons and combat. These enlighteneds were considered the ultimate super soldiers. The ability to artificially breed them would have been invaluable to the arms race against the Soviet Union. Sadly, the program was a failure in that regard. While the test subjects did indeed develop some psionic talents and became proficient with weapons and in many forms of combat, their abilities were inferior to those of a true enlightened. Nevertheless, the program director, Dr. Alexander Richter, soon found a new use for the surviving test subjects. While the limitations on their ability made the surviving test subjects unsuitable for use as soldiers, they could be employed in the far more specialized field of assassination. After several generations of additional experimentation and tinkering with the process, Dr. Richter managed to engineer a highly intelligent, emotionless, amoral, and frighteningly effective breed of assassins, which he codenamed assets. These assets were used by the U.S. government and occasionally by wealthy private parties to perform the most difficult, dangerous, and above all, the most sensitive assassinations. They were managed through an organization officially known as the Intelligence Support Activity. Officially, the activity, as it was known, was under the control of the U.S. Army, and was tasked with gathering actionable intelligence in advance of missions by other U.S. Special Forces units. Unofficially, the activity engaged in numerous black bag operations, including the asset program. Rickman flipped through the file further. At the core of Project Black Wolf was a drug code named D13. First discovered during the experiments, D13 was a chemical cousin of methamphetamine. However, D13 was a unique drug. Like meth, D13 was a potent stimulant. It also had potent hallucinogenic and dissociative properties, but it was not these qualities that made it of special interest to NSA. Rather, it was the drug's ability to activate psi talents in persons exposed to it that led to it becoming part of Project Black Wolf. D13 performed exactly as promised, proving to be a powerful psychic stimulant. Unfortunately, when the subjects were at the height of their power, they would also be tripping out of their minds and in the grip of violent paranoia. After coming down from D13's immediate effects, the subjects would retain modest psychic abilities, including telekinesis and limited ESP. But the use of those abilities would harm the subject's health. Moreover, the damage was cumulative and would shorten the subject's life to a significant degree. Overuse of the subject's psi abilities would result in severe headaches, impaired judgment and reasoning, severe nausea, episodes of extreme violence, and eventually cerebral hemorrhage, stroke, and death. Another interesting side effect of D13 was its ability to remove both the subject's emotions and any sense of empathy or morality. The combination of traits made it clear that the test subjects were not enlightened and would make poor soldiers in any case. These same qualities contributed to making the subjects ideal assassins. In addition to being injected with D13, the subjects of Project Black Wolf were also injected with synthetic anabolic steroids and subjected to neurological reprogramming. The end result was a perfect assassin. Assets were proficient with any weapon imaginable. Without a conscience or sense of empathy, assets would kill without hesitation. Without emotions, assets would experience no fear, regardless of the danger confronting them. Equipped with ESP and telekinesis, they would be almost unstoppable, yet their powers would be limited and their lifespans short, thereby ensuring that they would remain under the thumb of the federal government. Although Project Black Wolf failed as a means to breed enlightened, it was a total success as a means to produce assassins. Successful, that is, until Jack McCloud and Dana Blackwood entered the program 15 years ago. There was nothing remarkable about either McCloud or Blackwood at first. Both were ambitious, low-level Army officers looking to advance their careers. They had been offered the usual inducements to enter the program, and both joined without any hesitation. Both underwent the procedure without any unusual occurrences. A year after submitting to the program, McCloud and Blackwood fell in love and married, an unusual occurrence to say the least. 5 years later, Dana McCloud became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl, something that should have been impossible. Assets were generally rendered sterile from the Black Wolf process. The handful who remained capable of siring offspring would have children with horrific birth defects. And yet the McCloud girl was born without any of the usual birth defects. In fact, she was born without any apparent defects, period. She was of unprecedented high intelligence and possessed powerful psi abilities, including an exceptionally rare and dangerous ability called pyrokinesis. It was this ability that attracted the NSA's attention, although at first they had no idea of the full extent of the girl's power. As they would later learn, the girl was far more powerful and dangerous than anyone could have predicted. She was an enlightened, though her parents were not. But she was more than a garden variety enlightened. Even among enlightens, power such as hers was rare. Captain Rickman had met a dozen or so enlightens in her time with the NSA, and none of them had demonstrated power on the scale of the girls, and these were all older teenagers and young adults. Furthermore, none of them were capable of pyrokinesis. The girl was indeed powerful. She was also extremely dangerous. Attempts to capture and control her had ended with much death and destruction. It was for this reason, and this reason only, that Rickman had elected to use an asset to attempt to kill the girl. Rickman sipped her espresso as she continued reading through the girl's file. Charlie McLeod was far too dangerous to be left alive. She was indeed powerful, and she could not be controlled. Furthermore, she was not afraid to use her powers. These characteristics made her death a necessity. As she completed that last thought, Rickman picked up a photograph of the girl from the desk. The picture had been taken a few months before they had captured the McLeod girl and her father. It depicted an 8-year-old girl with waist-length, perfect blonde hair and deep blue eyes. In the picture, the girl was winding up to throw a snowball. She wore a broad smile of pure bliss as her long hair streamed out behind her in a golden comet tail, set aflame by the dying afternoon light. Her father stood a few steps behind her, looking on with pride. The girl in the photo appeared normal, innocent, and harmless as children are. Nothing about the girl's outward appearance suggested that she represented a more dire threat than even the most fanatical terrorists, or that she possessed a power greater than the largest of nuclear warheads. This would make what Rickman had to do that much more difficult, but necessary. Rickman put down the photograph and reached for the burner phone on her desk. She dialed a number and listened while the line rang. 7. As she slept in the abandoned cabin in Ashford, Charlie had a terrible nightmare. In it, she was walking with David and Catherine in the woods. It was late summer. The weather was warm but not hot. The sky was a perfect, cloudless span of blue. A soft breeze tugged at her hair and clothes. Gentle sunlight bathed the forest in perfect gold. Charlie smiled. "It's so beautiful. It's like heaven." She heard her own words as if she had spoken them aloud, though her voice remained silent. David touched her shoulder. "I'm glad you're having a good time. Come on, we're almost there." "This is the best place for a picnic." Charlie turned and saw for the first time a large picnic basket in Catherine's right hand. They were approaching a clearing. Golden panes of sunlight kissed its soft grass and gentle trees. Charlie ran ahead, calling to David and Catherine to hurry. As she neared the clearing, the sunlight grew warmer and brighter. Charlie's smile widened as her heart filled with indescribable joy. As she entered the clearing, the sky began to darken. Big black storm clouds began massing on the horizon. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Charlie stopped short, frozen in place by sudden. Purple lightning forked above, followed a moment later by an angry peal of thunder. Charlie cried out in fear and whirled around to see that David and Catherine were gone. A panic sound, half moan, half sob, escaped her throat. Charlie tried to call to David and Catherine, heeding the advice of the remaining light in her mind that insisted that they couldn't be too far away, but found that her voice had deserted her. Panic began building in her chest. A second bolt of lightning slashed through the air, illuminating the entire world in brilliant purple for a second. This time there was no peal of thunder, but rather a furious roar that nearly took her off her feet. Charlie screamed in terror. She spun around, intending to run, but froze instead. Standing before her, outlined by the flashes of lightning, was the dark figure of a man. It was hard to make out any details of the man's appearance, but she was certain it was indeed a man. He was very tall, much too tall to be a woman, slender and powerfully muscled. His arms were thicker than her thighs. The man's dress was dark and nondescript, save for the long, black cape that swirled around him as it was caught by the gathering winds. As she watched in terror, the figure plodded towards her with deliberate slowness. She screamed again, a shrill animal sound filled with panic and fear. Charlie tried to run, but found herself frozen in place. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Stay away!" She tried to speak the words, but found her tongue rooted to the floor of her mouth. The man continued towards her. Charlie's heart began to race, and she began to tremble. Thick, oily sweat beaded up on her skin. "Please stay away!" She was terrified, one step away from total panic. The man did not stop. As he neared her, Charlie could hear his breathing, slow, raspy, artificial, and the snap and flutter of his swirling cape. When he was within a foot of her, the man paused for an instant. At the exact same moment, lightning exploded above, illuminating the clearing in brilliant purple-white. In that instant of twilight, Charlie saw the man's full features. Heavy black plate armor covered his entire body. His hands were covered by thick black leather gloves, and his feet were encased in black armored knee-high boots. A long black sword with a leather-wrapped handle hung from his left hip. Above the shoulders, the man's head was encased in a black armored helmet. Beneath the helmet, the man had no face. There was only a skeletal steel mask. Even his eyes were invisible. A moment later, he was hidden by darkness. The man's gloved hand closed on her wrist. His strength was incredible, and yet he did not hurt her. Charlie screamed again and tried to pull away, to no avail. She tried to lash out with the power, but found that it too had abandoned her. Panic swept over her in an instant. She shrieked and struggled in vain to free herself from the man's iron grasp. He held her fast. His grip was like steel, though not crushing. It was impossible to escape. The man drew her towards him, even as she struggled to get away. He then turned her around and pulled her back against him with one hand, while the other closed his cape over her with the other. Charlie uttered one final terrified shriek. Then the darkness broke, and she found herself sitting up in bed, sweat pouring from her body and shuddering with terror. Someone was screaming. It took Charlie a full minute to realize that it was her, and another 3 to stop. David and Catherine had come into her room and were trying to comfort her. Charlie remained deaf to their words, as her mind was awash in terror. They were in grave danger, and from something far worse than the NSA. She could not feel what it was, only that it was something horrible. Well, that's it for Chapter 3. I will pick up with Chapter 4 in a day or two. And I hope if you made it this far, I thank you for your time and attention. And if you enjoyed the story, I would encourage you to subscribe to my channel and like the video. And feel free to leave any comments you have. I'm sorry about the noise in the background. I'm recording this at home, and my daughter's sitting here and is wanting me to get her a bowl of cereal. So I think I'm going to take off and do that. Have a great evening. Hope you enjoyed. Bye.